We can now bring in Melissa Sterry, design scientist specialist specializing in building architectural and urban resilience to wildfires. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Now, France has been gripped by extreme wildfires. What is making this outbreak particularly intense?
When we look at how fires behave, we actually have to backtrack well beyond the beginning of the fire. We have to look at two critical things. Number one, the rainfall, the precipitation, because that affects the plant growth. And ultimately, in these fires, as in all the fires across Europe, the plants are the fuel for the fire. You can think of them like the logs in your wood burner. So the more biomass we've got, then potentially the more fuel we've got, the bigger the fires can be. And then we've got to look at a whiplash, wherein if we have the kind of patterns in terms of the weather that we are now entering into and have been greatly amplified in this super El Nino year, those fuels dry out in heat waves. The lower the moisture level of plants, the more combustible they are. So that's a major factor in this. But there's also something else that we need to consider. Both in the largest area, the Gironde, where we've seen fires burning, and you can see it on the screen right now, we're looking at an augmented landscape. This landscape is not natural. In 1857, a law was passed that saw that entire area terraformed. And many of the lands across Europe, in France and beyond, have been terraformed. And the species you're looking at right now is the maritime pine. You're looking at plantations, and these are adapted to live with fire. They are resilient to fire when they are older. They're not as saplings because they're still vulnerable. So what we have got here is a perfect storm, because we have got increased heat, and we're going to see this all of the climate data is suggesting we're going to get more of the kind of patterns we've seen this year. We have got Mr. Nunes mentioned the arson. It doesn't matter if it's arson or if it's any number of other sources. The more you have humans in contact with these landscapes that are combustible, the more fires that you get. So we've got our ignition sources, we've got the conditions that make fires worse, and then we have got these huge areas of combustible land. And we need to be looking at that, because unless we look at that, we're just going to see this pattern repeat again.
Melissa, if you heard there from the Interior Minister, he essentially spoke about how this time, for the first time, French firefighters are seeing that fires are creating their own weather system. Can you talk us through what exactly that is, and why have they not seen this before here in France?
So my primary study region is the Western United States, but the kind of ecological systems that I study in terms of fire are very similar to those here in France, the Mediterranean and the temperate ecosystems. Now, when you've got that much fuel, and when you have got a fire burning, you've got that much energy that the fires have their own agency. You saw that with the major fire burning over Gironde, because that pyrocolumbus was sucking down oxygen from the upper atmosphere. So it basically has an unlimited source of oxygen. And when a fire is powerful enough, it brings in that oxygen. And when it's got enough fuel, essentially this is when you'll see fire tornadoes, you will see these various behaviors. The reason that we haven't had it here in France until now on record, and when we think about the records, we've got to go back really a few hundred years, because although we have handwritten records before that, it's only the last couple of hundred years we've got details. The reason you haven't seen it before is the heat that we have been experiencing, particularly here in France. Since July, it's been extreme. So it's the extreme heat in concert with that massive amount of fuel gives the fires their own agency to become huge conflagrations.
You just mentioned about trees not being native to these forests. Does that make some parts of the landscape more vulnerable than others?
Yeah, what you have here is actually the maritime pine is native to that region, but not in the assembly that it's in, because these are plantations. So you've got monoculture forests. You've got lots of even-aged stands. And so the whole structure of the forest is different to what it would have been. If we go back earlier than the mid 1850s, that whole region had a different landscape. There were pines there, but there were also there were wetlands. For example, it's famous that in that general area people would walk around on stilts because it was boggy. We have augmented many landscapes, including the Fontainebleau forest, wherein although they might have native species, the populations, the numbers of those species, their proximity, their density has changed. So that's where we have been. Essentially, this is unintended consequences. We had all the gear, we could create these plantations, but we did not understand back in the 1800s quite what we were creating.
The French Interior Minister, you heard there, was on the defensive, but he said that 9 out of 10 fires that are started in France have a human origin. How do you assess how the government has handled these wildfires so far, given that 250,000 people have been evacuated from the current fires that have been burning right now? And, we've seen wildfires happen year in and year out. Does it seem like the government has a handle on the situation, or were they caught off guard?
I think the government is doing a good job with a very bad situation. The defences, the firefighting capabilities are impressive. And from the perspective of the manpower that is gathered, both from central infrastructure, if you like, people that have been told to go to the fire front, and local communities, it really is exceptional. So I don't think we can knock France in terms of that aspect of it. But in terms of the approach that I would advocate here, we need to get ahead of the problem. We need to actually stop these fires gaining the momentum and the power that we've seen this season, and that is still ongoing. And to do that, we have got to make landscape interventions. This is going on in other parts of the world. And this is a very hot topic in Europe. So, for example, in Italy, they have a slightly different problem because there you've got abandoned landscapes. And just like, you see the people that are buying villas or houses for £1, €1 a shop, because the village is abandoned. And then the landscape is abandoned. And that means that the fuel risk increases because the combustibles build up. In Spain, again, so when we think about this, we have to think about all of the different factors, but certainly with respect to the ignition sources, we are facing a double whammy because on the one hand, arson, that's common. That's in the States, arson is a principal cause of wildfires. We also have more anthropogenic sources of fire because, of course, the more combustible the land is, the more likely it is that, let's say you're using machinery, a spark is going to ignite a wildfire. But then also, and here's the thing about fires, they don't just create pyrocolumbus clouds. They don't just create their own fire weather locally. We've actually got the science to prove that fires, through the particulates that go up into the atmosphere and how they affect the atmosphere, can actually cause lightning. They can actually create thunderstorms. In other words, the fires can create their own ignition sources. So this is a huge problem. But I do think the French government, as I said, given the conditions, given the circumstances, I actually think they've done generally very well.
Melissa Sterry, thank you for joining us on the program with your analysis. We're going to have to leave it at that. Thank you.